Welcome to another episode of Defending the Line. I'm Christy Shepard, and this is my podcast to share the story of what happened in the murder of my cousin Debbie Carter in our small Oklahoma town, and how finding out the men convicted of that crime were innocent turned into a quest for truth and accountability. So in every episode in the beginning, I mention this quest for truth and accountability. And I really had no idea in the beginning just how difficult and heartbreaking that would be. I thought that more wasn't being done about wrongful conviction because people were unaware that this was a problem. And I was really under this naive impression that Grisham's book would shine the spotlight on Debbie's case and others like it, and in turn would bring such outrage that lawmakers and others would really, climb on top of one another to try to fix this problem. And at this point, even though my heart was still very much in the cause, I'd really kind of sworn off ever trying to pass a law again because that was just so frustrating and really just disheartening. And I really wasn't sure at this point where I fit in to trying to be a part of changing this broken system. Because those that recognized the problem and had the power to change it didn't want to have any part of it. Politically, this issue of wrongful conviction is seen as soft on crime, and I didn't understand it then, and I don't understand it now, how the right person being in prison is soft on crime. And at this point, lawmakers of Oklahoma had failed to see the vision of learning from wrongful conviction. And without accepting the reality of wrongful conviction in our state, there was no way for them to see the irreparable harm that is done to the original victims in these crimes. Whereas on the national level, it was beginning to be recognized some. And so a little bit about the Innocence Project. So the Innocence Project that I've referred to in other episodes was the one that was started by Barry Scheck and Peter Neufeld, and it is based in New York City. But these projects aren't like a chain. They're all completely independent of one another. Even though they work together for a bigger cause. And these projects and other individuals who work in this, wrongful conviction world make up what they consider the Innocence Network. And as the list of exonerees grew across the country, so did the list of original victims that were being re-victimized by this process. So the Innocence Network had developed a statement concerning victims, and they asked myself and others to read it and, have input. And in part it read, "In seeking the exoneration of innocent individuals who have been convicted of crimes, the network is acutely aware that our representation may understandably concern victims and those of those crimes, as well as family and friends of those victims." And the full statement was presented at the annual network conference in 2008 that was held in Santa Clara, California. And the New York Project and Stephen had asked me to take part in a panel discussion about this statement. And this is really the first time that I had ever spoke in front of a big audience, and also really the first time that I'd ever been around exonerees other than, when I met Dennis Fritz. And in our breakout session, it was held in like a big auditorium with stadium style seating, and I was on the stage with the then director of the Office of Victims of Crime, which is under the umbrella of the Department of Justice, as well as another lady who I don't even recall. And I really felt out of place. These were very intelligent, accomplished women with high positions in the federal government, and I really didn't, kind of wondered how I had even ended up there. And I really, when it was my turn to speak, I don't have any recollection of what I said, but I remember being acutely aware of everything that was happening in the room. Anytime someone shifted in their seat, I noticed. Anytime that someone leaned over to whisper to someone else, I noticed. And again, at these annual conferences, exonerees are brought in and welcomed, and there's even special sessions that are held just for them. And I remember looking out into the audience and thinking, like, I couldn't distinguish who might be an attorney or who was an exoneree. And because that stereotypical visual sign of what someone who was an inmate looked like wasn't there. And it came time for the question and answer portion of our session, and I remember a very small, thin man sitting to the right of the stage, maybe a couple of rows up, second or third seat inside the aisle, stood in the aisle, and he addressed his question to the director of the Office of Victims of Crime, because in her response to the statement, she had said something about it was her job to represent victims and so on and so forth. And he stood up and said, "You said that you represent crime victims. Then do you represent me? I was sent to prison for 18 years for a crime I didn't commit. And because of that, now I'm a rape victim. So do you represent me?" And I remember she paused, and I felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. And I don't even remember what she said to him, but I felt so trapped on that stage. And I kept looking at other people, trying to find someone's eyes or something, and because I was really kind of astonished, like, does anybody else recognize what he's saying? Like, oh my God. And, this little, I say little because I remember him being very thin and kind of frail looking. And I thought it was so brave that he stood in front of all those people. There was probably well over 100 people in that room, and he spoke his truth, and he spoke about a silent reality that we know happens inside the prison system. And throughout my years as a psychotherapist, I have learned to carry the trauma and the harm of my clients, but this was very different. This wasn't professional. This was personal, and I really did not know where to put this. I didn't know how to carry this. It just hurt me so bad to hear him talk about that, and I didn't know his name, and for years I wouldn't know who he was. But later, I guess it was about a month or so later, close to Mother's Day, the Innocence Project was going to be honoring John Grisham for his advocacy, and they were going to present him with an award and ask if I would come to be there and bring Peppy. And again, we went, and it was springtime in New York City, and I was very excited to be there and share this with her. And we got there a couple of days early and did the, all the sightseeing stuff and that kind of stuff. And it came time for the event that evening, and I remember we stepped into the elevator, and there was a man in a suit, and he was holding a necktie in his hand. And he asked my husband, he said, "Man, would you help me tie this?" And my husband was like, I don't wear those enough. And if you want it to look right, you certainly don't want me to help you, And they kind of laughed, and he's, "Oh, thanks. He's really nice." And we got down to the curb, and he got in a cab, and we got in a cab, and, I didn't think anything else of it. And we arrived at the event that evening, and as we entered, there were these big screens that they were testing the audiovisual equipment and getting ready for the evening to start. And the man that was in the elevator was on the screen telling his story. And I was just kind of blown away. And I learned that his name was Jerry Miller and that he was the 200th DNA exoneree. And he'd been convicted in 1981 for a rape and robbery in Chicago and spent 24 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And after doing the math in my head, the man in the elevator was like almost 50 years old. And I remember being shocked at how young he looked in the elevator, especially after everything that he had been through. And so Peppy and I took our seats there at the event, and we were placed in a table that was pretty much right in front of the middle of the stage. And at our table was a district attorney from, I don't remember which state there, but both of Ron's sisters were there, Dennis Fritz, John Grisham, and the writer from the New York Times, Jim Dyer, who, Mr. Dyer was the one who wrote Ron's obituary that caught the eye of Grisham, that in turn led him to write the book, The Innocent Man. And Mr. Grisham was presented with his award, and we all took the stage with him, and he gave a very impassioned speech about meeting all of us and the importance of Innocent's work. And when the speeches and the dinners were all done, it was time for the entertainment portion of the evening. And this very young man, up-and-coming young man, by the name of Jon Batiste, I think is his name, who's now the band leader for The Late Show with Stephen Colbert, he took the stage, and he began to play the piano and sing "What a Wonderful World." And we're all just kind of listening, and Dennis leans over and says, "Peggy, come on, let's dance." And she's like, "Oh no, I'm not doing that, I can't do that." And he continues to insist and takes her by the hand and leads her up onto the stage. And they were dancing on stage to "What a Wonderful World." I mean, here she was dancing with this man who, for years, she believed raped and murdered her daughter. And it was really beyond poetic. And at the end of the song, he kind of gave her a twirl. And as they left the stage, the entire room was on their feet clapping, and people were wiping away tears, and it was really, really special. And 2 days later, it was a Saturday edition of the New York Times. This time it was Peppy's sweet smiling face that was on the New York Times. which included an article by Mr. Dyer that was entitled "Even After Great Loss, Embracing Innocence." And I'll try to post the video because there's a video of them dancing, and it's really, really sweet. And so this summer was really pretty busy. And again, I was trying to fit in and figure out what I could do to change what was so badly broken and had done so much harm to my family. And I attended another policy conference. This time it was held in New Orleans. It was much bigger than the first one that I had ever attended in New York. And we went around the room as everyone got there, and everyone was introducing themselves and who they were and what Innocence Project they were with. And I really thought about slipping out the back door because I thought, I do not know what I'm doing here. Like, this is insane. But it got to my turn, and I think I just said, my name's Christy Shepard, and I'm not with an Innocence Project. Oklahoma doesn't even have an Innocence Project at this time. And I began to be interested in these issues when I found out the men that were convicted of my killing my cousin were found innocent. And I said something to the effect of, my day job is a psychotherapist so that I can support my innocence habit. And I think I remember that Barry Scheck thought that was really funny. And Stephen interjected that Debbie was the victim in the John Grisham book, and that was my cousin, and that I had worked for 2 years to try to pass a law in Oklahoma, that I'd worked for 2 years by myself trying to get this done, to start an Innocence Commission. And even though they were very welcoming and everyone was really glad that I was there, which has always been my experience, I really spent the rest of the conference trying to understand half of what was being presented and discussed. The leading causes of someone being convicted of a crime that they didn't commit are eyewitness misidentification, bad forensic science, false confessions, informants. I had no idea what a Brady violation was. I was completely in the dark about this idea of blind and double blind suspect lineups. I had certainly no idea how informants worked. And I could not begin to understand how someone would confess to a crime that they didn't commit. I mean, what sane person does that? And the conference wrapped up, and my family and I went on home, and I got down to the business of trying to better understand these issues. And I could understand eyewitness misidentification in that I was familiar with how trauma affects the brain, and studies have been done on this for years and years. And I learned even more about cross-racial misidentification and the issues with that and how that occurs. But this whole idea of someone confessing to something they didn't do, I think that was probably, again, very difficult for me to understand. And that's probably one of the things that I get presented with the most that people can't imagine happens. And what I had come to learn was that there's something called the Reid technique, which is the most widely taught and used method of interrogation by police. And the focus of the method is to extract a confession. not for the suspect to tell the truth, but to confess to something. And the police can lie to you, and they can tell you that they have evidence that they don't have. They can tell you that they have information that they don't have. But one of the things that bothered me the most was learning that there is an adult version of the Reid technique, and there is a child version of the Reid technique. And that this method of using the child version is viewed as being appropriate to use with a suspect as young as 10 years old. And I think what bothered me the more I learned about this was it took all the things that I know about being a therapist and how people work and how they, function inside their minds, taking all of that and turning it around on people. And we're going to talk a lot more about the Reid technique. We're actually going to have a bonus episode that'll be coming out a few days from now. I'm going to visit with a retired investigator who also taught investigation, and so he's going to talk to us a lot more in depth about this issue of the Reid technique. And so moving on to one of the other issues was this issue of jailhouse informants or snitches. And I had read a book. I read several, but in one, this book is titled Snitching, and this is a passage from the book. So it says, "Snitching also teaches a destructive lesson in civics, that the law is for sale. Criminals who escape punishment by informing have in effect bought their freedom. The government's willingness to trade away liability even for violent and destructive crimes sends the public message that the law can be broken under the right circumstances, and that people can get away with murder even if they know how to play the game." That really landed hard considering Debbie's case. Another one was in this book, Snitching. It says, "Criminal informants make the legal process secret and unpredictable, governed by personal relationships between police and criminals rather than public rule. Crime and punishment can be negotiated off the record, under the table, subject to the law of the urban jungle." And just to give you an example of this is not kind of an arbitrary thing that just happens. So I want to give you an example of, again, in Debbie's case. So what I have here is some of the transcript from the civil suit, and this was from the district attorney, and this deposition was done in 2001. And so I'm going to read that from here. So he's asked the question, the attorney's asking a question about jailhouse informants. And he said, there's also people that might be called drug informants. So they're trying to, agree on jailhouse informant and drug informant. And he says, have you heard that term? And the DA says, that would be correct, yeah. And he says, there's people who inform on different people all the time, yes. And the attorney says, as a drug informant would be an individual that would give information about narcotics dealing. Is that a fair definition? And he says, in some cases, yeah. And the attorney says, and has your office ever paid individuals to be confidential narcotics informants? Answer, I'm sure we have. Then the attorney says, and some of these individuals might even be given deals on cases where there would be charges or changes of, where there would be charges of sale or use of narcotics in return for their information and cooperation. He answers, I'm sure there have been. And then the attorney says, you've done quite a number of these, haven't you? And he says, well, I don't personally do it, but I'm sure that there are others in my office who have. And the attorney asks, when you say you don't personally, you mean other prosecutors in your office will do that? And he says, sure. He says, you've never done that in all the years as a district attorney in drug cases? He says, yeah, sure, drug cases. He answers, I could have. I don't recall. The attorney says, and is there anyone in particular in your office that would be involved in dealing with drug informants as an area of expertise? And he answers, I think all the investigators deal with informants, whether drug or otherwise, all the time. So again, this isn't something that just happens in big cities or happens. This is standard practice. People are paid for their information. They're traded deals for their information. And career criminals know this game, and they know it well. Now, how it's supposed to work is that any dealings or whatever is supposed to be information that has been divulged. What I've learned is that doesn't always happen. So, in learning all this, it made me wonder what kind of sweet deal that Terry Holland must have received to earn her title that she has a C spot. I mean, what were the chances of her being in the county jail at the perfect time not to hear one but two confessions in these what were becoming very high profile cases in this town? Not to mention that, don't forget, they chased her all the way down in a different state over hot checks and extradited her back to Oklahoma. And she was in the county jail at that specific time. So I wanted to share with you what is then talked about this is in a 2017 deposition. And this is the district attorney again being deposed in 2017. And talking about Miss Holland and her involvement. So I hope I don't lose you on this, but the question from the attorney is, who is Terry Holland, Mr. Peterson? Answer, my recollection is she's a criminal. Isn't it true when you say criminal, what does that mean? I think she had some theft problems and some drug problems, but that's just my memory is telling me. Was she an informant? Not that I recall. Have you ever put her as a witness before? I think Terry Holland, I can't be 100% question. Were I to tell you that she testified in 2001 in the case of Fritz versus the city of Ada, and do you recall testifying in that in 2001? He answers, I remember giving a deposition in some time under Fritz and Williamson case. Do you recall being questioned about Miss Holland in that deposition? I have no recollection of that. Do you recall being asked this question, giving this answer? Did you know Terry Holland before the case? And giving the answer, I knew her. Do you recall making that statement? No, sir. Is that accurate? I have no idea, but I do know who Terry Holland was. She was a criminal. Do you recall being asked the question, have you ever put her on the witness stand before, and giving the answer, boy, I think she, as I'm sitting here, my memory is that she testified that I know of in 2 different cases, 2 homicides. Do you recall? And then there's an objection about I guess another attorney is asking if this Terry Holland is associated with this case, and the attorney answers yes. And he says, so the attorney again says, my question was, do you recall being asked this question and giving this answer? Have you ever put her on the witness stand before? Boy, I think I'm sitting here with my memory is that she testified that I know of in 2 different cases, 2 homicide. Do you recall being asked that question and giving that answer? He says, I do not recall it. If it was sworn deposition, then I probably said it. Would you agree that that's accurate then? Okay, it's accurate. I don't know. I don't recall it, so I can't dispute it one way or the other. Question, do you recall being asked the question, all right, one was the Haraway case, and give the answer yes? He says, excuse me. He says, do you recall being asked the question and giving the answer, one was the Haraway case, and your answer was yes? And I think that harkens back to the question about, have you ever used her as a witness before? And your knowledge using her as a witness in the Haraway case. And Peterson answers, well, okay, I don't recall ever. I know my memory is she was in the Fritz and Williamson case. She was in the jail at the same time one of them was. As far as her testifying or being a witness in the Haraway case, I can't recall. I don't have a memory of that at all. The attorney says, apparently, would you agree that you had a memory of it in 2001? He says, I could have been mistaken. Well, let me show you your testimony. And he says, okay. And I guess says that they are going through it. And they're talking about excerpts of it. And it says, would you attest that the statements that you've made were accurate? And he says, the district attorney answers, I may have been confused, but I'm sitting here right now, and I don't recall her being involved in the Haraway case at all now that I'm sitting here. I just don't. I think I was mistaken. So he does not remember Miss Holland being involved in the Haraway case at all, according to his deposition. And what is alleged in here is that she was given a deal. She was afraid back in 2001 to do a deposition for fear of retaliation because she was up for parole. But then her husband at the time, and if you watch the Netflix series, they talk about this in the series. Her husband and her son talk about this, some of the things that were going on. And she says that, and to this day, I have no idea what kind of deal she may have been given to testify against Ron. But according to her and her husband, she was given a deal to testify in the Haraway case, that she was allowed to get married to her husband, and that he was facing 40 years for like stealing prescriptions and some robbery charges, and he ended up getting 7, and that was the deal that she made, according to her. And so the Haraway case she testified for first. So a few years later, she would testify in Debbie's case, and I can only imagine what she may have gotten or what favors, or, I mean, we don't know. And I guess we never will. She's passed away now, and we have no idea. So the other hurdle that I was trying to jump and figure out was this significance of these Brady violations. And I've talked about it a little bit in an episode before when I was answering a question. So again, a Brady rule, it was established by the Supreme Court in 1963. And basically, the way I understand it is that the prosecution has to turn over any evidence to the defense that might be exculpatory, which I guess might prove or assist that, there might be another suspect or that this person didn't commit the crime. So prosecutors possess this awesome power, and they have absolute immunity. So if this rule or this law isn't followed, it doesn't seem like there's any direct consequence to the prosecutor. So it seems like laws that govern prosecutors are really just empty threats. And if the police never turn over this exculpatory evidence, there's plausible deniability that, oops, I didn't know. And they're also in a position to decide what is and is not exculpatory. And what I learned, and we'll share with you all, what I learned through Debbie's case was this issue of exculpatory evidence and how there is no training. So again, I'm going to give you these examples. So this was from a deposition from the OSBI agent Rogers, who was deposed in 2017. And the question by the attorney was the method for, do you know if the method for the government receiving or the district attorney receiving exculpatory evidence was through the prosecutorial report, or if there was some other method of sending to acquire that information? And he says, I have no idea. And the attorney said, did you receive training while you were with the OSBI in how to identify potential exculpatory evidence? And he answers, specifically, I don't recall that. Did you provide Mr. Peterson or any of the attorneys in the DA's office in Ada with any investigatory documents? And he says, I don't recall that I did. So Agent Rogers says that he knows what exculpatory evidence is and how it's supposed to work, but there's really no process of how he did or didn't get that to the district attorney. And that was in 2017. So back in 2001, this person was the assistant chief of police in Ada at the time, who was in charge of training officers as well. And he is asked, "Are you familiar with the term exculpatory evidence?" And he answers, "I have been. The meaning excludes me right now." And the attorney says, "Okay, if I were to tell you that there were evidence of innocence or tending to show innocence, at least tending that direction, so that it was helpful to the defense, would that make sense?" And he says, "Yes, sir." And the attorney says, "Okay, do you recall conducting any training or there being any department training on exculpatory evidence?" And he says, "No, sir. I'm sure that's something we covered in our legal block at CLEAT, but insofar as the department, no." And the attorney says, "And your legal block at CLEAT, is that part of your basic training?" And he says, "That's basic training, yes, sir." And that's something that does not have to be repeated unless the officer wants to after their first few months. And he answers, "That would not repeat basic training. Most of all the officers have at least twice that amount of training on their record at this point in time." And he says, "Do you recall for certain that exculpatory evidence is covered in the legal block?" And he says no, that he has no recollection of that. So he has no recollection of any kind of specific training on exculpatory evidence, and the meaning of it eludes him, that he can't define that, what that is. And he's also in charge of training. So it seems like exculpatory evidence in this issue of a Brady violation is a big deal. But, and I'm using Debbie's case as an example, but this is something that happens everywhere all the time. But this is the one that concerns me the most, obviously. So, another example, and this was a deposition in 2017 with the district attorney, Peterson. And he's being asked about Brady and if he knows what his responsibilities are. And he says, or the questioning attorney says, "So you, in fact, had basically two levels of reliance. You relied upon your knowledge of the law, but you also expected that the law enforcement professionals that you considered to be seasoned were also doing their part as well, and with their working knowledge of the law as well. I believe you mentioned earlier that it was your understanding that they also received training in those areas." And he answers yes. And the attorney says, "Please correct me if I'm wrong. Is that how I understood your testimony?" And he says, answer, "No, I expect them in their police academies and schooling afterwards, just like we have continuing legal education, that they would be aware of the changes in the law. I expect them to put it very bluntly, to give me the good, the bad, and the ugly." So he expects them to be trained and know their job. It talked earlier that he doesn't do any training with them. Nobody can recall when they got this training. They can't define what exculpatory evidence is. And that was in 2017. So I'll have another example here. So this was a deposition from 2001 in the Williamson and Fritz civil suit. And this one was with the chief of police at the time. And the questioning attorney says, Mr. Miller, are you familiar with the term exculpatory evidence?" He answers, "Basically, yes." "What does that term mean to you?" "To me, it's something that one party in a lawsuit would have access to what the other party has." The attorney asked, okay, if I told you that it meant in a criminal case evidence that tended to show that the defendant was innocent or at least in some way was helpful to the defense, would that make sense to you? And he answers, I know nothing about it. You could tell me that and I would believe you. The attorney says, okay, do you have any training regarding that kind of evidence? And he answers, no. And the attorney says, do you know if the Ada Police Department has ever had any training regarding this kind of evidence? And he answers, not that I'm aware of. And this is in 2001. Brady was established in 1963. This is in 2001. She was killed in 1982. Then just a few years ago, it was after 2017. I think it was around maybe 2018. It was after the Netflix show came out. There was a federal hearing for Carl Fontenot in the Haraway case, and I attended that hearing. And the police chief at the time, who was this Mr. Miller, who I just read his statement, he was asked by Fontenot's attorneys to bring the policy manual for how they kept evidence and that kind of thing. And he got on the stand and he didn't have it. He literally had a sheet of paper with a paragraph on it. And the defense attorney the Fontenot's attorney was upset with him that he didn't bring it. And he really had no answers, anything past the answers that he gave in 2001. And the next day it came out in the paper that he was retiring. So again, there is no accountability, no one being responsible for the fact that after all this time, after the mess that they've made of all this, they still just a few years ago don't know, can't define what exculpatory evidence is, don't have any training, don't have a policy. And there's no one that answers for that. There's no one. They just retire and move on with their lives. And there's no one held accountable. In most of these cases that I've read about, wrongful conviction is a combination of all of these factors. And in Debbie's case, the prosecution likes to say that they were unknowingly relying on bad science that was later trumped by the DNA. But the truth was the DNA in the hairs were just the key that proved to, Williamson and Fritz were innocent. But it was the combination of eyewitness misidentification, a dream confession, bad science, jailhouse snitches, backdoor deals, a long list of misconduct that led to those convictions. And no one answers for that. The more I have learned about all this, the more torn I have felt. And it is very much reality that the issues are much bigger than my family. But I struggled then, and I still struggle now with whether that I wanted it to be bigger than my family. So in the next episode, we're going to talk about my visit to prison to see Glenn Gore and facing some other harsh realities in doing this work. So feel free to send in your questions and I'll do my best to answer them. And if you would, send your questions to defendingthelion@gmail.com. Sometimes if you send them through Messenger or something, I don't always get them right away. So yeah, if you'll send them through that, that would be great. And you can go to defendingthelion.com for other information and updates, as well as Defending the Lion on Instagram and Facebook. And you can watch these episodes on Defending the Lion on YouTube. And thank you for listening.